Hello, this is David, and welcome to the Top 10 Worst JRPG Dungeons 8-Bit Edition. The era of the 8-bit systems was when I was first introduced to the RPG genre with gems such as the Final Fantasy and the Dragon Warrior series. And while these games are great, some of the dungeons are of questionable design, going past a bit of difficulty into the territory of out-and-out frustration, with creating your own maps, finding hidden doors only after using obscure items, and requiring hours of grinding just to get through the place. So come and join me for the stuff of childhood nightmares, the top 10 worst JRPG dungeons of the 8-bit era. Number 10, Final Fantasy, the Marsh Cave. This game is a classic, and for good reason, but that doesn't mean that there weren't a lot of horrible dungeons to choose from. In fact, Final Fantasy has the dubious honor of being the only game to appear twice on this list. The Marsh Cave is only the second dungeon of the game, so you would think that it would still be rather simple, but you would be dead wrong. It's one of the hardest in the game. Locating the dungeon is a task in and of itself, as it's pretty far from the nearest town. Then, once you're in, you're greeted with a multitude of enemies who can poison and paralyze you, as well as mobs who are immune to physical attacks. It's well known that to have any chance of survival requires copious amounts of grinding, as well as tediously buying an extreme amount of heal and pure potions. And did I mention that the boss at the end also has instant death attacks? Good luck! Number 9, Crystalis, the Goa Fortress. What's everybody's favorite dungeon types? Forests? Caves? Mountains? Icy areas? Volcanoes? I bet you nobody said sewers. Well, here's an NES maze sewer, and if that's not bad enough, it's peppered with bosses all throughout. So this is not only a maze, but also a sewer and a boss gauntlet. Fun stuff! In addition to this, there are hidden enemies, shooting projectiles, pitfalls, and moving platforms. It's like the designers went out of their way to find the things that everybody hates and threw them all into one terribly long dungeon. To make matters worse, arguably the hardest boss in the game is located here, and like all good RPGs back in the day, you have to be a minimum specific level to even damage him. Number 8, Final Fantasy II, the Empty Rooms to Nowhere. This isn't a complete lodge to any particular dungeon, but really all of them, and the poor design choice thankfully never reared its ugly head in any future installments of the series. Normally, whenever you reach the end of a path in any other RPG, you either get a treasure or, it just ends. But not here. Instead, you're greeted with a door, or many times, multiple doors. If you enter the wrong one, you're placed in the middle of an empty room with a ridiculously high encounter rate. The game essentially punishes you for exploring by dragging you through 3 to 5 battles every time you enter one of these doors to nowhere, and unfortunately, they're scattered just about everywhere in the game. Number 7, Glory of Hercules, the Hades Shrine. This is a Japan-only game that many of you may not have even heard of. However, it spawned a long-running series, though the only official entry that we got was that terrible DS game. But that's quite enough about that. Let's move on to the awful Hades Shrine, which is simply one of the most diabolical mazes I have ever seen in any game, and to top it off, while you're exploring, you can't see any more than 2 spaces in front of you. Even the Radiant spell in the first Dragon Warrior let you see further than that. This is coupled with some questionable design choices such as the lack of MP so that all magic actually drains your HP, and weapons having durability so that monsters can break them during a random battle in the middle of this dungeon. Oh, and did I mention that there's also hidden doors in this hellacious maze? Number 6, Final Fantasy, the Earth Cave. Now, there was a definite toss-up between the Earth Cave and the Ice Cave. However, at least the Ice Cave is mercifully short, though exceedingly difficult. The Earth Cave wins out due to the sheer frustration factor of the mazy layout, coupled with the Hall of Giants, which, granted, you didn't have to go through. But if you were exploring and didn't have the Nintendo Power Guide, you were pretty much up Shit's Creek if you wandered in there. The cherry on top, however, is that you have to go through this cave twice. First to defeat the vampire, then leave the long way, because you don't have access to the exit spell, only to turn around and go back through the cave again with an extra 2 more floors to fight Lich. After 5 long floors, you'd better hope to God that the first fiend doesn't wipe the floor with your weakened party. Number 5, Earthbound Beginnings, Duncan's Factory. There seems to be a point where I pretty much stop playing this game each time I go through it, and that's right around the time that I get Lloyd. Coincidentally, that's also right around the time that you have to go through Duncan's Factory. Simply put, this map is massive, bigger than even some towns, and to make matters worse, it's convoluted with tons of wrong turns and dead ends. It's a tunnel maze with an utter lack of any sort of landmark to help keep track of your location. This game already has a reputation for being difficult, but this early dungeon just slaps you across the face with it. Number 4, Phantasy Star, Baya Malay. As you can probably tell from the makeup of this list, I was definitely a Nintendo kid. I didn't own any Sega systems growing up. However, with the advent of emulation, I went back and played through many games that I missed, and man, I can't imagine having to go back through these dungeons as a child. First-person dungeons are hard enough for me in general, but the worst offender of all of these is Baya Malay. It consists of 8 floors chock full of extremely hard enemies, dead ends, pitfalls, and trapped chests. Hopefully you find the crystal while you're in here too, because without that, you can't beat the final boss. Then, when you barely survive the trek to the top, you're met with another dead end where you get no indication on what to do, so you have to use not just 1, but 2 different items in order to move on. Imagine getting to the top only to not know what to do and getting stuck. I'm sure that happened to a lot of frustrated kids back in the 80s. Number 3, Zelda 2: The Adventure of Link, Death Mountain. This is pretty much the only Zelda game that I consider to be an RPG, but that's a debate for another time. Relatively early on in the game, Link has to traverse the aptly named Death Mountain, which is a huge tunnel maze with branching paths, dead ends, and extremely powerful monsters that can kill him in just a few hits. The axe-wielding mobs are just the worst, and well yeah, there are some later areas in the game that are arguably more difficult. Death Mountain comes so early, and Link is so unprepared for the onslaught that this easily gets my vote as the worst dungeon of the game, and maybe the entire Zelda series. Number 2, Dragon Warrior 2, The Cave to Rhone. This is the great granddaddy of god-awful dungeons, and its reputation precedes itself. Not only are the monsters extraordinarily hard, but the dungeon itself actively tries to kill you and disorient you with a great number of invisible pitfall traps and hallways that loop and repeat themselves with no warning to the player. Also, like Baya Malay, you have to find a plot-related item in here that, without, you can't progress through the game. To add insult to injury, once you're done with the cave, you're still not safe because you have an overland journey to the next save point, and on the way you can encounter pretty common enemies that can cast Sacrifice, immediately killing your entire party with no recourse. Number 1, Final Fantasy III, Sylx Tower. While those mini and job-specific dungeons were a close second, this one takes the cake. There's normally nothing wrong with making a difficult final dungeon. After all, this is when the party is at the peak of their strength, but Final Fantasy III took this to an extreme. Sylx Tower isn't just one dungeon, it's multiple dungeons, all back-to-back with no saving in between unless you leave. The vast majority of the best equipment and new jobs are guarded by powerful bosses, 7 of them in all, that you have to defeat before even entering the Dark World at the end, where the most powerful end bosses await you. It's a long, draining slog to get there, and one that many people just won't have the patience for, especially if you die, because nobody wants to go back through that awful place again. I hope that you guys enjoyed this, and what are your worst 8-bit RPG dungeons? Did you guys agree or disagree? Let me know in the comments, and as always, have a good day.